I don't really want to go through every one of the Psalms, all 150 of them. And so I'm just cherry picking some that I like. Uh, I guess if well, let's do it this way. If there's one you would like to go through, all you have to do is let me know in the comments. And I'm not bullish on having to only do what I want to do. So, but pardon me. Psalm 18 is an interesting psalm, and it's not very short, so it's going to take us a while to get through it. And I want to approach this a little bit differently than I have the other couple that we've gone through. Instead of looking at every tree and every leaf and every piece of bark, I want to look at the forest. I want to look at, okay, there are things that we will have to get pretty specific about in order to be able to set it within its historical context. But instead of, I have this, as you well know, have this tendency to go for the ticky-tack, and there's no reason for that. Well, maybe not no reason, but I'm going to depart from that, okay? So the psalm I've selected is Psalm 18. I'm going to just read it a little bit at a time, and let's walk through it. The heading for this, and I'm going to use the New Living Translation instead of the NIV. It's not very, the heading is not very different. The difference between the NIV and the NLT is not very great. Both are phrase-by-phrase translations as opposed to word-by-word translations. The ESV is much more of a word-by-word. The New American Standard Version is much more of a word-by-word translation. It for me, it makes the text not very conversational at times when you're going word by word. And frankly, and I don't want to get deeply into the whole thing of translation, the hermeneutics of that, but we need to admit this and realize this about any translation of the Bible. Every translation of the Bible is going to have to make choices about which English word to use for which Hebrew or Greek word. And if you've ever tried to translate something or have something translated, you realize a word-for-word translation, number one, the syntax from one language to the next is rarely the same. I can't think of a time that it is. And the other is your word-for-word translation just doesn't convey the meaning that your statement called for. I learned this on a CIY trip to the Dominican Republic. I got to be on a team that went to teach at a Christ in Youth conference in the Dominican Republic. In the Dominican Republic, Spanish is the language. Pardon me. I do not know Spanish. I've probably told you I've only learned a few words in Spanish, and so when they mentioned to me, these were students, and many of them had some elementary English skills, but Spanish was their native tongue. So I thought, I had a girl in my youth group who was in Spanish 3 or 4. I mean, she knew Spanish, right? And so I gave her my outline, my student guide sheet that in English, and asked her if she would translate it, which she did. but she is not a conversational Spanish speaker. She knows Spanish, but not on that level. And when the class of Dominican Republic youth got the papers that I handed out, they kind of looked at it and began to laugh, because what was on the paper, well, it didn't represent what I wanted them to get, because the syntax was bad, and the choice of translated words lacked finesse, to say the least. So I learned you can't just go word for word. Every translation is also an interpretation. It's an interpretation of the intended meaning of the writer or speaker. Well, a word for word translation it still requires interpretation, because you still have to select an English word for a Greek or Hebrew word. And there may be, in many cases, there are 2, 3, or 4 possible words for that one word, English words for that one word in Hebrew or Greek. Now, on this big tirade to say, you in order to do that, you have to interpret meaning. One of the most enjoyable and fulfilling experiences I had was many years ago, probably 15 years ago now. I was invited by the Warsaw Christian Bible Institute to teach in the same curriculum in 2 weeks, back to back, in central Poland. They were training lay counselors, and I had experience working in that at Canyon Ridge, where I was at the time. I went. I hardly know beyond hello and good morning and thank you in Polish. I was given an interpreter, not a translator, but an interpreter, whose name is Khrushchev. And we formed a wonderful friendship. But he took my words and he interpreted them into Polish so that the students would get my intended meaning. All right. The NIV and the NLT are translations. They're not paraphrases, but they are phrase by phrase paraphrases. So there's a little lesson on, word for word versus thought for thought or phrase for phrase translations. Anyway, I'm using the New Living Translation, the NLT, and it offers this as the heading for Psalm 18 for the choir director. A psalm of David, the servant of the Lord. He sang this song to the Lord on the day the Lord rescued him from all his enemies and from Saul. This sets a little bit of a historical context, and when you just looking at this, for the choir director, that's not a big leap for me. David was a musician. I've been a choir director, and some of the most fun and most frustrating experiences of my life in my early career were in directing a choir. It can be an amazing, and I would even say glorious experience. But sometimes you want to pull your hair out. So I think David understood this. I don't know that he ever directed a choir, but as the composer of dozens and dozens and dozens of psalms, which were not just poems, they were poems set to music. he would have had. He understood the life of a choir director, and so he writes this for the choir director. It's a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord. He could have called himself something else. The mighty warrior, because he was. The king of, if not the most powerful empire on the face of the earth in his day, then at least one of the two or three. But he calls himself the servant of the Lord. This is a humble moniker. This is how I would most want to be remembered, as a servant of the Lord. And I think it'd be true for you as well. And then he goes on to say, if I could, I'm going to set this into the first person. What's the word I want to use? This little introductory paragraph says he sang this song to the Lord. David, I sang this song to the Lord on the day the Lord rescued me from all my enemies and from Saul. When you put it in the first person, it kind of has a different ring to it. And now we're into my interpreting of the text. Who do you sing this song to? To the Lord. Now, I won't say all of the psalms that David penned were songs sung to the Lord. Some were a statement to the community, to the nation. But this he sang to the Lord, which is an act of worship. I'm kind of feeling like I really am wanting to look at the forest, but here's part of the forest. We live in an age where music has become the one-dimensional interpretation of worship in the church. I know that's a strong accusation, but this comes from my experience and observations. We sing, we make music, and that is our worship. Well, it can be. In its best form, it is. But worship is not one-dimensional. Okay? Second thing. You already know I have this bias. And I don't want to be judgmental about it, but my observation is that in many cases, those leading worship, the music, are much more in a performance mode. It seems like it's a concert of sorts. There's nothing evil about a concert, but my desire is that if we're together and we're making music as an act of worship, the only thing that makes it an act of worship is that it is sung, performed to the Lord. I don't think I'll ever have the platform to present this to the folks who are leading in this way in churches. If I ever do, I don't think they'll want to hear it from an old guy. But so let's take it out of the context of, boy, they need to change, down to, when I'm in that room, am I singing to the Lord? That's not their problem. That's my issue. We'll pick it up pretty much where we left off here today, next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.